wood.
Yeah, preferred order or just
Since you were looking at me. Okay, I have a few things to say about identity, race, and feelings of belonging, based on a research project that I completed recently, along with colleagues from Winnipeg and from Calgary. This was a 3-year research project in which we followed young people from grade 10 to grade 12 in schools in all these 3 cities. And I was obviously responsible for following the young people in Toronto. So these were about 70 young people, both boys and girls, in 2 schools in Toronto. So based on that study, what I found was that identity for these young people was not an issue. They moved seamlessly between their multiple identities and their affiliations, as they moved seamlessly between speaking different languages, dressing in different ways, eating different kinds of foods. They didn't necessarily see conflicts among these identities, nor did they feel the need to give salience to one identity versus another identity. They combined elements of their own countries of origin or their parents' countries of origin, because in Toronto, the students were either immigrants or children of immigrants, almost exclusively in schools that we gathered data in. And they combine those experiences with experiences of growing up in Canada as a young person. When I show you my data, you'll see that they're very much oriented towards consumerism, as other young people here, but also added elements that they associated with their countries of origin or their parents' countries of origin. Very aware of privileges that they enjoyed in Canada, and often mentioned the level of security they enjoyed here, the access to high-quality education and healthcare that they as well as their families enjoyed in Canada, which their relatives in their parents' countries of origin did not. The youth were also very aware of international issues, much more so than we had encountered in the other places where we collected the data from young people who had been living in Canada for multiple generations. These young people, who very often lived in neighborhoods characterized by high-rise buildings, a very high level of ethno-racial diversity, and low incomes in that neighborhood. Within the confines of their schools in these neighborhoods, they did not feel discriminated against. They said everybody is a different color, everybody speaks a different language, everybody's got different foods and languages and so on. So we're all the same. We're not discriminated against. However, they were very sharply aware of the discrimination they encountered, as well as their racialized friends and families they encountered, as soon as they began pushing those boundaries. So they were aware of being followed in malls by the security officers because of their racial character.
She says that equity is a dirty word. Well, guess what? I'm the director of Equity, Diversity, and Human Rights. I think I'm getting dirtier by the minute. But you know what? That's an interesting, I mean, after hearing both of them, I'm happy that I didn't write a speech, which I usually never do, but I did write some ideas down because I had this email from Professor Harold sort of talking about what he expected us to talk about. And I'm like, okay, it's meaning of life, right? Generation, race, identity, any confusion. Canada became multicultural, not because of me. Canada was always multicultural. First, nations, peoples. Canada had cultures, languages, diversity of population. When I think of my race, I never think of Canadian experience, my lived reality as part of my culture. Why is it that I always think my culture is that time capsule? As opposed to the fact that I live here, I shovel the snow here, I pay my taxes here. Why is this not part of my culture?
The first thing I wanted to touch on as a member of the media in this kind of discussion was the Shafia case. Because if you look at the front page of the newspaper for the last several months, you would have thought that Canada is a country in the midst of a deep cultural crisis. I don't know that any of us would agree with that necessarily, but I do think that this case has become a significant moment for at least the next few years in Canada. Obviously, its details were distressing for many people. It's a very horrible crime. But what it has come to represent, I think, is perhaps the singular example of life in a repressive home where that repression is justified with reference to culture and religion. And I think that probably it's going to be a lens through which we see many other cases that are going to come up in the coming the generation gap that is foremost in Canadians' minds right now, and that's the difference between a first-generation immigrant parent and a Canadian-raised child. So you see the conflict going on between kids being raised in Western values, wanting to adopt a Western lifestyle, and their parents who may be clinging to their notion of a time capsule, have very different ideas about how life should be lived and about how, an example of these young women, how their sexual lives should be controlled. So that's one kind of generation gap that I think is maybe at the front of people's minds. But there are about 5 or 6 others that I thought. I take myself, for example, grew up in a Canadian school system where multiculturalism is built into you from an early age. I've often, had most of my life believed that multiculturalism is a great system, that Canada is accepting of all cultures, and that compared to other countries, we do very well on measures of integration. I think the older generations, say people baby boom and older, they weren't raised in that same environment. They came slightly later, and they are a little more open to questioning multiculturalism. And so I think that we see a little bit of a divide there in that generation, from the younger to the older Canada. As a reporter, I spend a lot of my time focusing on those points of friction, because that's where the news tends to go. If there is some kind of spectacular incident of violence, or if there is a case where cultures are clashing, for example, we've seen a few of these instances in Quebec recently, where at the YMCA in Montreal, where somebody wanted to smoke the windows put up so that they couldn't see during exercise when they got past. Those are the kinds of things that we tend to focus on, which gives you a bit of a distorted view of how Canada is doing on the whole. And by most people's measures, Canada does do fairly well on scores of integration. But I think when you do find, to get back to the question of belonging, when you do find people who don't feel they belong, there's often something profoundly wrong. And I think of the work that I've done. I spent a long time working in the on a series called Neighborhood. Took me back there sporadically for 3 years. And the genesis of that project was the rise of gun violence in Toronto in about 2006, I think it was. And much of it was affecting young black men, and so I sort of got to know a group of teenagers, about 20 of them, and spent a long time with them trying to get to know what their lives were like, and followed them over the course of a couple of years. And in getting to know that group, what struck me was how, although we were living in the same city, separated by 15 kilometers of other neighborhoods, they really felt like they didn't belong in Canada. Canada was not a welcoming place for them. And I was really surprised by the depth of that feeling that they expressed. And as you mentioned earlier in your research, that they were very comfortable in their own neighborhood, but as soon as they stepped outside, they felt that the world was set up for them to fail, and that it was more or less against them, and that they faced huge obstacles of racism every day. More recently, I've been doing some work on writing a book about Aboriginal gangs in Western Canada, and some of the things I hear are very, very similar. So it strikes me that having a sense of belonging is very important to the person's health and life outcomes. Not that these are the only people who feel they don't belong, but to run into it twice in two very different contexts, but expressed in very similar ways, struck me as certainly noteworthy for this topic.
The question is, where does there's not much political involvement from the smaller communities. And I've asked myself why. Every time I see the political parties doing their announcements, I don't see myself there. This recent federal government has eliminated a lot of women from their platform. So there you go. Women are not needed in the federal government. Minorities, same. So if that's, it's something that is lacking, and I guess it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Unless you see yourself there, then unless you want to go there. So how does political involvement be, first of all, is it something that is needed to fill that gap?
I'll leave the how to somebody else. But I think you're absolutely correct, and I think it's one of the biggest challenge we have. I think that we often speak about the finances that's needed to participate electorally in our politics. So what does democracy really mean if money is available to political participation? And I think that's one of the reasons why you see far fewer women of whatever reason, but also that you see fewer relations as big men as well. From political communities, because I think as well, one of the things I was thinking as I listened to the other speakers is that we really need to pull apart. And so we talk about racialized communities all the time. We shouldn't forget that there are differential experiences within that. The experiences of Black women are not necessarily the same experience as South Asian women, for example. So keeping that in mind, that I think that is one of the barriers, and I think that it is difficult.